Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Derek Keown. It's a great honour to be president of Dublin City University. It's a second honour for me this afternoon to welcome everybody virtually to our campus here in Glasnevin. For our international guests, this week we had a new bank holiday. We had the feast day of St. Bridget, the first of our national holidays called after a woman. But in the Celtic calendar, of course, the first day of February marks the first day of spring, and certainly it feels like spring here on our beautiful campus with the bulbs beginning to flower. Our guest of honour today, Giulio Amato, doubted that we have a spring in Ireland, but just to assure you that we do have four seasons. I'm delighted to welcome everybody virtually here to DCU. My only regret is that we're not here in person to kind of baptize this publication in the traditional fashion with some hospitality. It's lovely to see people from across the city, the country here, the continent and beyond. I'm particularly pleased to welcome back, and I say welcome back to the university, our two guests of honour, Herman Van Rompuy, who was former Belgian Prime Minister and the first President of the European Council, and of course the distinguished Giuliano Amato, former Italian Prime Minister and Vice President of the European Constitutional Convention. And both of them, of course, giants in terms of the development of the European Union, to whom we're both hugely grateful. At a domestic level, I'd like to welcome the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Science, Professor Derek Hand, and I see members of the governing authority of our university are present as well. It's wonderful to have you here, and I think particularly the profile of our two contributors this afternoon really demonstrates the standing of this publication, and also the pedigree of our colleague, Professor Federico Fabbrini. And of course, really I should call him Cavaliere Fabbrini. Congratulations, Federico, on that honour from the President of Italy. I'd like to congratulate you on this, your latest publication, the EU Fiscal Capacity, Legal Integration After COVID-19 and the War in Ukraine. You will note too from the book that this is Federico's 8th book in 8 years with Oxford University Press. And that is only the books that he has published with Oxford University Press, just to say. It's a very timely publication for us. It focuses on the response of the European Union to the pandemic, but also, again, in that very current way, the response of the Union to that horrible and illegal war in Ukraine. That we are living through a time of upheaval. Many of our assumptions have been shaken, but many of our convictions and confidence in Europe, I think, have been confirmed. And trials like this and change like this are troubling for us all, but they also present opportunities for transformation. Europe is certainly at an inflection point, and the scholarly contribution like Federico's, and indeed the work of the Brexit Institute here at DCU, is critical as we navigate that kind of uncertain future. First and foremost, I suppose, what Federico urges in this volume is that we think big, that we embrace a vision for closer cooperation, and to imagine, in that great Italian way, imagine the benefits that will bring to us. The European ambition, just from a kind of personal perspective, that the European ambition and the values outlined in Federico's book chime very closely with the vision of our University of DCU, that we are on the edge of the continent, but we're very much at the heart of Europe. And our new strategic plan sets out a vision for the university and an ambition that we will be recognized as a leading innovative European university. And by that, of course, we mean our character and our complexion more than our location. The Brexit Institute has been kind of hugely important for us in developing that kind of internationalization agenda, that sense of being at the heart of Europe. Apart from the policy and teaching that the Brexit Institute has led out on a number of very significant EU-funded projects, which include the Jean Monnet network called Bridge, Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence called Rebuild, and a European Horizon grant called Regroup. All of them, of course, with verbs in their title. So we look forward to the next success, Federico, from European funding. So the book launch provides continuity with this work and highlights the commitment of the university to furthering the European profile. But first and foremost, I say it's an opportunity for us to celebrate our colleague, Federico, on all his achievements and his contribution to the university. And a really unique opportunity to welcome here today our two great contributors. So without any more ado, I'd like to hand you over to distinguished Shona Murray, who will lead proceedings for this afternoon. So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, Shona.
Thanks very much for that, Dara, and hello everybody, and welcome again to the launch of Federico Fabbrini's latest book, EU Fiscal Capacity, Legal Integration After Covid-19 and the War in Ukraine. And thanks again to our speakers, two majorly influential figures of EU policy, former Italian Prime Minister Giuliano Amato and former President of the European Council, Herman Van Rompuy, both of who will have a lot to say on this subject, having considered the issue, even tabled proposals on fiscal capacity long before it became a reality back in 2020 during the darkest days of the COVID pandemic. Now, before both of our speakers will give a presentation for 10 minutes. After that, we'll have a discussion. So please do send in any of your comments or your questions into the chat, and then we'll come to Federico to speak to us about his latest timely endeavour. So without further ado, Herman Van Rompuy, the floor is yours.
Herman, you are muted. You need to unmute yourself.
No, you can understand me? Okay.
How it works.
Thank you. Federico's book brought back memories from almost a decade ago. At the informal European Council of the 24th of May, 2012, I presented a text tasking myself with writing a report. And I'm quoting, I looked it up, and the quoting goes as follows: to take the economic monetary union to a new stage, there was a general consensus, I said at that time, that we need to strengthen the economic union to make it commensurate with the monetary union. I will report, I said at that time, in June, on the main building blocks on a working method to achieve this objective. Frankly speaking, I took the European Council by surprise. They didn't expect that kind of proposal. That proposal had grown out of the awareness that since early 2010, since the outbreak of the Greek crisis, we had only had an approach in which member states had to put their house in order. We had not addressed the systemic flaws in the architecture of the Eurozone itself. The Eurozone, as for that matter also the EU, is more than the sum of its parts. And too many lack this understanding. And that's why the decision on the recovery fund called the Next Generation EU, that's why the decision on the fund in the summer of 2020 was so important. It was the recognition that there was an EU problem as such that went beyond the challenge for a few countries individually. I come back to the four presidents report. A few weeks after the launching of the idea, in June 2012, there was already a first report on the table with proposals for a banking union, a fiscal union, economic union, and a greater democratic legitimacy and accountability. The European Council then specifically decided to create a single supervisor for the major banks in the Eurozone. And that was a breakthrough that the European Central Bank was waiting for to come up with its own unprecedented action to show that it would do everything it could to defend the currency. But truth be told, The further path towards a genuine economic and monetary union stalled after the summer of 2012. And the reason is simple. The Eurozone had been saved and was never in danger again in the years that followed. The political momentum had passed in 2012. A decision was still taken in 2019, 7 years later, on the entire second part of the banking union, namely the single resolution mechanism for resolving failing banks. But the third part of the banking union, in particular a European deposit insurance scheme, got nowhere. On the economic and fiscal union, nothing has happened until the Next Generation EU Recovery Fund in May 2020. However important this fund is, it's only a part of the EMU, and moreover, it was temporary. The lesson I draw from all this is well known. The union can, in fact, only take big decisions in times of crisis, with the knife at its throat and the abyss in front of it. It then does so, to the surprise of many, and we surprised often ourselves. Dear friends, the fiscal capacity we thought of in the Four Presidents report was a stabilization tool, creating a shock absorption function, for instance, to act together in the event of a downturn in the economy. But I am more inclined to see the New Generation EU as a growth instrument, not a stabilization instrument, a growth instrument to prepare for the green and digital transition, now also the energy transition. Precisely because it aims to fundamentally change our model of economic growth, it cannot be temporary. After all, the problems do not stop in a few years when the recovery fund is no longer there. Moreover, on top of that comes the energy scarcity. One can still keep up a little pretense by saying that member states can spend the unused funds in the 80 billion package on energy, and so there is no urgent financial needs. But that does not solve the long-term problems for the Union as a whole to cope with the transformation of our economy and our society. That need for a European fiscal capacity, and that need is increasing by giving member states much more scope to provide national support to their industrial companies. This is a real threat to the single market and allows the law of the jungle to prevail in the Union. To compensate for this more flexibility, so to speak, on national subsidizing industry, to compensate for this, there should be precisely a real European fund to give equal opportunities to all member states. We have already seen that race to save its own skin in 2022, when each country individually looked for energy suppliers others than the Russians. It still ended reasonably well, but it was not a model of cooperation. That's an understatement. We are far from the European community of coal and steel of the 50s, which was also, don't forget that, about energy. Energy at that time was mainly coal. The Next Generation EU and its financing, as mentioned, was a breakthrough. Yet it left the spending itself of the sums mainly to the member states. This also means that there is no room enough for supranational initiatives. And in today's world, however, scale, size matter. A permanent instrument could be much more focused on Europe-wide projects. May I add a footnote here? With the UK, the Next Generation EU would never have come about. Never. One is free to draw conclusions from this. Fiscal capacity is not an end in itself. It serves the objectives of the Union, where the Green Deal and strategic autonomy are central. Those who want the goal must also want the means. A question, but it's a rhetorical question. How can the EU play a geopolitical role if it is so dependent in strategic areas? You know the answer. We need to get away from mere market thinking, where people are looking for the cheapest energy, the cheapest batteries, or the cheapest telecommunications. This commercial mindset has plunged us in today's energy crisis. Had we made ourselves less dependent on Russian gas and oil after the annexation of Crimea, the current energy crisis would have been avoided. Against all agreements made in 2014, we continued in business as usual, literally and figuratively. We were not ready to think geopolitically, including the so-called big countries. National and economic interests were more important. Sometimes I'm not sure we are learning the necessary lessons for good. Sooner or later, another crisis can occur. Think of Taiwan. The question of whether we should work to amend the treaties to have a full-fledged fiscal capacity is, of course, legitimate. And Federico elaborated that theme in depth in his book. The political question is whether the 27 can take that step without a crisis moment obliging them to do so. Personally, I'm not in favor of a fundamental change of the treaties, but of changes in the treaties. I would not repeat the 22-23 convention. There is too little consensus in the Union today for that. It would be a debate that divides more than it unites. Instead, I would focus on well-defined changes. In any case, if the Union is to be widened, it will have to be deepened. The rule of unanimity on foreign policy and taxation is, inter alia, once again on the agenda. A number of member states want to postpone the enlargement process, for instance, with regard to Ukraine. Further enlargement could be quicker than many think. And why can we not think of a group of wise men and women who, as in 1999, would formulate proposals on what should be on the agenda for a possible intergovernmental conference? The Conference on the Future of Europe was a good exercise. It ended in May last year, a good exercise, but it did not carry enough political weight. You know, the European institutional framework will always be ambiguous, hybrid, particular, specific, or hermaphroditic, as Giuliano Amato said a few years ago. The world in which we are working on the Four Presidents report is a different world from today. The primacy of economics has been replaced by the primacy of politics. I would even say the primacy of geopolitics. The EU must act in unison, as we have done much more than expected in recent years. But we need to be even more aware that we need to be more than the sum of the parts. The European interest, the European common good, is something other than just the sum of national interests. That was the lesson of 2012 I talked about at the beginning of this short introduction. I would like to end by thanking Federico Fabbrini for his book, as always, very precise, and above all, very committed to the European cause, our common cause. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Herman Van Rompuy. Fascinating. I'm really looking forward to delving into some of those issues. But first, former Italian Prime Minister Giuliano Amato, you have the floor.
Yes, I thank you, Shona. And I thank Federico for the book, which, as Dave said in his introduction a few minutes ago, is really timely because fiscal capacity is the issue of the day. Of course, it's not perceived as such. Other issues, the war, climate change, green things, strategic autonomy, but you can't have these things if you don't have fiscal capacity. This is the point. So it's a sort of prerequisite nowadays, so whatever our policies intend to be. We arrive at this firm belief after the pandemic, after the next generation EU, but let us be clear with ourselves. It was an exceptional event, the pandemics, and we activated the clause of the treaty that refers to exceptional events, which several of our member states said it means that we are doing it now, and here we are. It is not a precedent for the future. This is the point we have to deal with. We can go on by considering future events, whatever, even the current events, as new exceptions that justify new exceptional funds, but it wouldn't work. It would not work. Actually, the Four Presidents report mentioned by Herman already 11 years ago wrote quite clearly that we needed a European fiscal capacity for several reasons. Yeah, Herman is right. At the time, stabilization seemed to be the main goal to be pursued by common funds. Being aware, all of us, that we can't bestow upon monetary policy the entire needs of stabilization, and we have been paying a price for this unilateral approach to stabilization. They were right, but the only progress in the following years in this report was the increasing of the number of the presidents signing it, because the following year it was the 5 presidents report, and then they stopped increasing the number of the presidents and taking seriously what the report was asking. We needed the exceptional event, and we know, Jean Monnet already said this to us, that it's throughout crisis that the European community at the time finds the resources to overcome the obstacles that always exist to further steps in the process of integration. Welcome the crisis and welcome the next generation EU. But I'm convinced that we cannot go on exception after exception. We are already again in a situation that requires common funds. And we are discussing nowadays whether strategic autonomy and the investments that are needed for Europe to accomplish this strategic autonomy should be financed throughout common funds or throughout national state aids. Now, whoever cares about our integrated market and a balanced growth of European economy should fight for a common fund. Unhappily, in brackets, I think that we are going toward the national state aids that will furtherly fracture our market and create other several problems. In any event, the battle is still ongoing, and the need for common funds, as Herman was saying, in this occasion, for growth and investments more than for stabilization, are needed. But stabilization still could be tomorrow, next week, in 2 weeks, a reason for using common funds. A few weeks ago, we were speaking of the need for common funds due to stabilization, facing, as we were facing, more a future phase of stagflation than a phase of growth. Now it seems that stagflation could be over, but it could arrive at that point, again, stabilization and common defense, the war. Common defense is another priority for all of us. Common defense means the main common good at the moment, the main European common good. And these two should be financed by using common resources. So one way or another, because we have to finance strategic autonomy, because stabilization could be needed again, and we can't leave it only in the hands of the European Central Bank, because European common goods must be produced one way or another. We should repeat the experience of the next generation EU. But we can't go on by using each time Article 122, because one exception after the other can't be exceptional. It becomes ordinary. And we know that even in terms of financial order, we know that the debt of the Union for the next generation EU funds is out of the budget, because within the framework of the existing discipline of the European budget, according to Article 311, 312, etc., there is no room for this big rock that has remained outside. And whether the repayment of the debt is based on own resources or not is disputed nowadays. So even the legal standing of the existing common funds is somehow based on a subtle legal platform. For the future, we cannot use that platform again and again, which means that, and Federico clearly and keenly opens also this chapter, it's the final chapter of the book. Yeah, relying perhaps too much on the sort of promoting force of the Conference for the Future of Europe. I don't even remember the name of this conference because it has remained more on the books than in the life of all of us. So, but independently of it, like it or not, if we want common funds for the future, on the basis of the stabilization mechanism as a previous experience, assure next generation, we should think of something that politically is difficult. It's difficult because really what we should do is to disentangle the decision on the own resources from the will of the individual member states, which is quite a change, We know that Article 311 says clearly that any decision on the own resources should be approved by the parliament, by the member states, according to their constitutional requirements, etc., etc. I am well aware that the objection here is, but this is a federalization of the European Union. At that point, it's not a union anymore, it's a federation. No, I'm well aware that in order to switch from the union to the federation, perhaps we will have to do what the Bundesverfassungsgericht said years ago in the Lisbon Urteil. And therefore, perhaps also changing some of our national constitutions. The German Grundgesetz, they say, does not allow the German institutions to completely change the system and switch to the federation. Okay, but a decision on the own resources, not necessarily is a decision that in terms of principles goes out the framework of a union of states. So we should work on these specific, very limited, but I understand huge in terms of principle change, only when the union will be, how should I say, autonomous in deciding the own resources that are needed, we will really face the difficult future we have to face. But I agree with Herman that some more difficulties have to be faced before this will be accepted in our union. Let the climate change work as it is horribly doing. In a few years, the Europeans will realize that they are going member state by member state before taking a common decision is disruptive not only of their money resources, but of their lives. At that point, I must say, and this is my conclusion, that I rely on climate change to convince the Europeans to give their union the powers that are needed to face the terrible challenges we are going to have in our future. Good luck.
Thank you very much for that, Giuliano. Really appreciate it. I might just go back to you, Herman Van Rompuy, about a lot of things that you said there. I mean, both of yourself and Giuliano make the point that the EU only acts when it's staring into the abyss, when there's an extreme crisis. And you also made the point that this crisis of COVID was a challenge that went beyond just a couple of member states. So it gave the impetus to act for the whole of the EU. Nonetheless, were you surprised to see that your proposals for fiscal capacity made in 2012 did finally materialize, and did they do so in the way that you had sort of figured, or what was your own interpretation around that time? Were you surprised?
Mm-hmm. I felt it already before I left office in 2014. I remember that I made proposals together with the Commission on having a stronger economic union. That was part of the 4 presidents' report at that time. It was defended, yes, by the Italian Prime Minister of that time, Enrico Letta, It was supported, but not enthusiastically, by the European Commission. And that's it. And it will not elaborate on this, but it was a nice idea to have agreements between the Commission and the member states on structural reforms and so on. It was not touching upon the competencies. The idea was to have agreements, but then I felt the momentum was over. I haven't imagined that we had to wait until 2019 before we took a next step in the banking union, not even the economic union. And then came 2020, of course, with this highly exceptional event. So I felt it from the beginning that, we need not pressure, we need a crisis. I fully agree with what Giuliano just said about exceptional events, and that we shouldn't go from exception to exception. But at the end of his intervention, he said something that is really common sense. But the climate change is not an exceptional event, it's an exceptional development. And we should recognize that climate change, there will not be a point omega where everything is collapsing. It's an evolution, but we all see where we're heading to. And we all see that is really exceptional because the survival of the human race is at stake. I really think that we have to reinterpret, we need a reinterpretation of this word exceptional events and extend it to some kind of exceptional developments. But my last remark is the following. We can make such kind of intellectual statements, but of course we need a political push. The political push will not come from the Conference on the Future of Europe.
Exactly.
The political push, yes, the Commission can play a big role in all this, but without a Franco-German cooperation, nothing will work. Nothing will work. If they cannot agree on, I'm speaking now again on the fiscal capacity, on making permanent the fiscal capacity. If they can agree on an initiative as Merkel and Macron took that initiative in May 2020, if they cannot do it without the pressure of a crisis, thinking at the future of the union and the future of even their individual countries. So if they don't take that initiative, nothing will work. You can put proposals on the table, but we need a strong political push. And of course, the Commission then can join and make more concrete proposals. But without a strong political will, it will not work. It will not work. The only substitute for a crisis is a political will at the highest level.
Giuliano, I mean, that is the most important point, isn't it? That's why we got to this place in the first place, that Germany and France decided to push for next generation EU. How far away are we from that, given that we have the crisis? We don't have to wait for a second pandemic. We have Ukraine, climate change, energy, cost of living. So how far away are we from that agreement, do you think?
Well, unhappily, we are not so close as I would hope, for the simple reason that at the moment, the need for funds is more on the investments linked to strategic autonomy. Let me use this sort of formula, than on other goals. For the strategic autonomy investments, we know that also state aids can be used. France and Germany are the member states that have more national money to devote to state aid connected to. Therefore, their agreement could be found on these. Let us be more flexible in state aids. In the future, we will also build up common funds. Those who are familiar with the daily European debate recognize in my words what is actually being said in Brussels, preparing the next European Council meeting. So I expect a strong agreement between France and Germany in the two ways policy. On the one side, more flexibility in the use of state aids. On the other side, the preparation of common funds. What I see as a consequence is that the first side will come true. The second side will remain a sort of two presidents report, the president of France and the chancellor of Germany. Therefore, what should be now needed is the other member states who are less strong in terms of national resources for state aids. They should join and say to France and Germany, listen, put this national state aid aside for a moment and let us concentrate on the common funds. At that point, but we will know in a few days.
Mm. Herman Van Rompuy, we saw this high-level visit to the US to discuss the Inflation Reduction Act, calling for transparency on tax credits, on subsidies. Obviously, there's a huge fear that companies will be rewarded for locating to the US. So, I mean, obviously, we know this is very pressing. Is this going to be the very influential factor in the decision around fiscal capacity?
Yes, of course, because the Inflation Reduction Act triggered this new idea for giving more flexibility on national state aid. It triggered that in Europe. And so how can we respond? And one of the solutions is we will respond by making it more, giving more possibilities for member states to subsidize their industry, as the Americans also are doing. But then, and Giuliano mentioned it, and I said it also in my introduction, some member states have more fiscal leeway than others. And so you see a double movement, the movement of asking for more flexibility on the one hand, and the weaker member states, the majority of the member states, are saying that this is really a danger. There's really a danger. And some of them are saying we are asking some kind of compensatory mechanism, and that's the European Sovereign Fund, in some way the successor of Next Generation EU. So you have the Inflation Reduction Act in the States, you have this response on national subsidies and giving more flexibility inside the European Union. But in the Union, some are saying, let's put everybody on equal footing. Let's have a level playing field in the Union. Let's not destroy the single market. So we need a European fund to finance in a European way the necessary investment to respond to the American challenge.
Could I just ask you one point that you made there in your introduction as well, that if we hadn't gone through with business as usual after Crimea, we wouldn't be possibly in as bad a situation as we're in. Can you just tell us, why was it business as usual after some flagrant disregard for international law? Why did it continue?
Yeah, that's a long story. There are, of course, economic reasons to have good relations with Russia, because Russian oil and gas is cheaper than when it had to come from Azerbaijan or from other places in the world. So there is this economic argument, and for some countries it was an absolutely key argument. Then there was also this strong belief that Russia is there forever. Geographically, nobody can avoid Russia. So we need good relations. We need good relations, and we will change the Russian regime and the Russian behavior, also in the national, in international, in geopolitical matters, also related to Ukraine, by having close relationships with them. It was a famous wandel durch Handel, change through trade. But they underestimated Putin. Putin had a clear political agenda, and he's ready to pay a huge economic and humanitarian cost for having this political nationalist agenda. So it failed. We believed him, and with hindsight, we shouldn't have believed him. We saw already what he did in Ukraine. The annexation of Crimea was already at that time illegal. And actually, our response, and I can give you many examples, that our response was weak. The only strong response we got, we had, it was after the downing of that Malaysian airplane, the MH17. We fought during weeks and months in the European Union to impose sanctions on Russia. And then came the downing of the airplane. And then all of a sudden, I had not to convene a European Council. I had not to convene ministers. It was decided on the level of ambassadors, because it was so obvious that Russia was behind it. And we needed at that time a response. But we needed a tragedy before we could agree on sanctions. So there were a lot of people and countries and leaders who still believed that, let's say, that negotiation and talks was the right way to deal with Putin, even if he had already annexed Crimea, and even after the destabilization of the Donbass, because at that time already the Donbass was in the hands of Russian-minded so-called volunteers. It's a complicated story, but that is the past. We shouldn't to extend too much on that.
Oh, Giuliano, for Van Rompuy and Federico just says it in his book that there's an absolute need, it's imperative essentially to abolish unanimity on tax issues if we're to maintain a fiscal capacity on a permanent basis. And remember, you're talking to an Irish audience. I will not completely, but certainly in DCU. So how likely is that? How important is that? And of course, what does that do then to the democratic deficit of small member states who would lose out on their influence?
This is a difficult question indeed. This is a difficult question indeed. In my view, the point remains that even though the fiscal capacity cannot be an exceptional, once upon a time kind of decision, it requires a strong difficulty of the Union to solve its problems otherwise. Several difficulties independently of climate change, which is my real weapon somehow to force the Union to be something more than a union of states. Some other difficulties can emerge in the future that at the moment I cannot even imagine, but what is striking for me is that the pandemics arrived. Did you expect it? No, nobody expected it to come, but it arrived. And all of a sudden, all of the member states realized that negotiating the supply of vaccines one by one was going to be a disaster in terms of supply and in terms of price. And so what happened? Without any reform of the treaty or also of European primary legislation, there was a sort of private contract between the states and the Commission, and the state said, you will negotiate in my name, and all of us will accept you as a proxy. And it worked wonderfully. And we realized that by reducing from 27 to 1 the negotiator, we could have an enormous advantage. It was a win-win situation. The Commission was winning a sort of undeclared competence. The states were winning in substance. It could happen again with energy. With energy. Now we are looking for alternative suppliers of energy. Can you imagine each of us negotiating separately with these states, etc.? It would be economically and financially a disaster. It could happen with strategic autonomy. Again, the raw materials that are needed for most of these innovative things in relation to which we want strategic autonomy, the batteries, well, these are very difficult markets. And if you multiply the demand, prices will go up and the entire European economy will pay a price. So, I'm saying, there is always something that can be used, And already Herman was saying that now, thinking of the state aids, etc., versus common funds, we have a majority of member states who are against the flexibilization of the state aids European rules. Of course, not all of them are in favor of common funds, because as usual, the northern side of our map says no to this. And we southern tend to spend more money. We want debts because that's the southern way of life. Okay. So this difficulty also has to be faced, but simply Europe may find in the events of the future more than one window of opportunity. It needs political leadership, because no window, even if open, is crossed if nobody has the courage to do it. So we have to rely mostly on France and Germany. But the initial step can be made also by others. I can't forget that all of the huge thing of the European Convention for the Future of Europe, that after all was the sort of where the Treaty of Lisbon substantially found its main clauses. Well, it was not a French nor a German, but a Belgian prime minister. It was a friend of us who is still in the European Parliament, Guy Verhofstadt, who created a group of Europeans. I was a member of that group. Others were members of the group who were not with us anymore. And he organized the European Council, in which what he had created, envisaged, more than 100 questions. We had prepared more of 100 questions around him in Brussels, meeting almost weekly. And the European Council accepted all of these. So, I mean, the final step needs the big ones, but the first step can come from anybody who has the mind and the courage to do it.
That's why I proposed in my introduction this group of wise men, thinking
Exactly.
of what happened before the convention. And
Exactly.
we actually,
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, just continue there. Did you want to continue your point there, Herman Van Rompuy?
No, we're just,
Okay.
no, it was just mentioning that this group was created and they prepared the intergovernmental conference and the convention later on.
Just because
and
this
Amato, Giuliano was a member of it, together with my late good friend Jean-Luc Dehaene.
Jean-Luc also was there.
Yeah, I was a member.
I remember that Tony Blair wrote a letter to me, because at the time he too was part of our company. And he said, I will send with you a young man, very clever. He will work with you. He's reliable. You will see. He has a future. And it was David Miliband.
Yeah.
Who worked with us. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember.
Herman, what do you think? Where do you think this sort of leaves Brexit, I suppose? Because, I mean, the UK is obviously not part of the US, nor does this have a seat at the table regarding fiscal capacity, which is something that will affect the UK in years to come. I mean, I suppose this is a Brexit institution. You said that fiscal capacity wouldn't have happened if the UK was still a member of the EU. Where does that leave Brexit? Do you think it may cause the UK to reconsider, or will they be left out? What's your position?
Oh, of course, we are speaking in front of the Brexit Institute. No, but it was just a remark. Some were telling just after the referendum, 2016, if the UK would reapply, so to speak, when the Remain would got the upper hand, and then you had the negative referendum in June 2016, and then they assumed that they would like to rejoin. What would happen? I think in the beginning, a lot of countries would have said, of course, they are welcome. It's a political amputation for the European Union to have lost the UK. I'm not sure you will get the same answer today. Of course, it's a hypothetical question. Why? Because we saw in the last years a number of things that with the UK were just impossible to achieve. Giuliano just mentioned the common purchase of vaccines. I'm not sure, and that's an understatement, that with the UK you could have had that kind of initiative. Of course, the next generation EU, forget it. And there are a lot of other examples that you can imagine, and I'm just mentioning the most important ones. And in the future, of course, we will need much more Europe-wide initiatives. That's why we are discussing now this permanent fiscal capacity. So the future is not to have less Europe. The future is to have more European cooperation. I will say it in a provocative way. What we need is an ever closer union. And that's I'm now using words that are really provocative. And can we do this with the UK And during decades, we found a solution, and the solution was the opt-out. Go ahead, let's say the 2027, we will not stop you, but we will not participate. Of course, this is in the longer term untenable. So what I meant to say is that the mindset in the European Union it has changed dramatically. The caravan continues without the UK, and I belong to those who said in the beginning we miss them. I belong now to those who are saying we don't miss them, and it is up to them one day if they change their mind. But that is not let's say for my lifetime. I will not see that promised land. But you should realize that a lot of things that are happening today, we can do it with 27. We couldn't have done it with 28.
Wow.
May I say something on this?
Yes, absolutely. Then we can move on to Federico. But go ahead, Giuliano. Yes.
No, very shortly, because Federico remembered, I was in your institute some years ago discussing Brexit before the referendum, and my view has not changed. It has been, because the consequences are still with us, a big mistake. I can't imagine another mistake so big as this one. One, because the UK as such would lose something, and it is losing something, because the Irish problem with Brexit is an unsolvable problem. There were already problems in Ireland, but they were somehow being solved. Brexit has created a new unsolvable problem. I've studied all of the possible technicalities. Michel Barnier has done the same, but there is no solution. Either the Northern Ireland gets out completely of our relationships, or it remains, but the UK is not united anymore because a part of it is part of the European Union, but not of the UK. There is no solution to this problem. Now you will have to cope with it for some years. As Herman said, somehow we are lucky because this is part of the window of opportunity. We have some years without the UK that we can use to go ahead with the process of integration without them creating obstacles. So we can speed the process of integration. In a few years, the UK will be ready to enter again, and it will enter into a more integrated Europe without having put obstacles against this integration. It could be the best of the possible worlds. Let's hope it may happen.
Oh, listen, this has been really fascinating, and I really thank you for your time, but I'm under huge pressure to hand back to Federico. But thank you to our speakers, Giuliano Amato and Herman Van Rompuy, and apologies for the delay. Federico.
Thank you very much, Sean. I'm really honored to be with you all this afternoon, and I would like to start by thanking warmly Giuliano Amato and Herman Van Rompuy for accepting to debate. They are really two giants in the field of EU policymaking and national policymaking as well. And I should say Herman really takes the credit for the title of my book because, as he said, he came up with the expression fiscal capacity 11 years ago, while at the same time, Giuliano, who has been my mentor and model ever since he was my professor during my PhD at the European University Institute. I hope he really saw his approach, a pro-European approach, in the book. So it was great to have them here. And I want to thank you, Sean, as well. You are formally on maternity leave, so I'm grateful you take time off to chair this event. And lastly, allow me also to warmly thank my colleague and friend Dara Kyo, director of DCU, for hosting this precedent book launch and for supporting my work, including now that I am on sabbatical at Princeton University. I'm conscious of time. I just would like to raise 3 quick points to conclude, and they are by no means aimed at addressing all the issues that emerge in this fascinating conversation. But the 3 points are basically 3. 1, fiscal capacity. 2, Brexit. And 3, the role of education and research on European affairs. So on the first point on fiscal capacity, most has been said, but I would agree with Herman and Giuliano that NGU completes economic and monetary union, achieving the goals that many had set a decade ago. This is a change for the constitutional architecture of economic governance in Europe. And as I argue in the book, is a push in the direction of fiscal federalism in many ways. Nevertheless, I think both Giuliano and Herman have emphasized that this process remains ongoing. Certainly the war in Ukraine is helping. After the book was published in early December, the EU adopted a new instrument, the macrofinancial assistance instrument for Ukraine, which again is 18 billion euros of common debt. So in a sense, the needs on the ground help in continuing this process of establishing a fiscal capacity, but there's need for more permanent solution. And I also think there's need for adequate institutional reforms, whether this happens through a major treaty change or a more piecemeal one. We have to enhance the legitimacy and effectiveness of the EU. A second quick point about Brexit. Obviously, I feel compelled to say something about it as the founding director of the Brexit Institute, but here again, I think both Giuliano and Herman have pointed that out, that probably Brexit created a dividend for the EU. It would have been so much harder to move in the direction of next generation EU with the UK as a member state. We don't have a counterfactual, but definitely the UK had always opposed fiscal integration. So Brexit did spur and allow the EU at 27 to move ahead. What I would also notice is that following Brexit, the economic trajectories of the EU and the UK have been totally different. If you think about Next Generation EU, that's almost 1 trillion euros of funding that goes to the member state. The UK created a UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which is worth 2.6 billion pounds. That's peanuts compared to what the Next Generation EU Recovery Fund is putting out for member states. So definitely the UK is worse off. And that takes me to the final point I wanted to make this morning, which is about really the role of education and research on European affairs. That's something people working on Brexit have pointed out a few times. My sense is that academics working on European law, European politics, European economics have a responsibility to be engaged on current European affairs and to give their intellectual contribution to debates on the future of Europe. And I hope my book has contributed somehow to do that. Certainly, it tries to do that by bringing up themes which are important for decision makers as well. But this goes hand in hand, I would say, with the responsibility for higher education institutions to invest on European studies. In a sense, European studies are now part of the civic education of a European citizen. Think of Ireland, Shauna. We are marking the 50th anniversary of Ireland membership in the EU this year, which means that most Irish people will have lived the entire life as citizens of the European Union. But we need to keep them informed about what the EU is, about what the EU does, about what the EU can stand for. In this respect, I'm very proud that Dublin City University is leading on its matter, positioning itself as a hub for research, teaching, and policy on EU affairs, thanks to the Brexit Institute, thanks to the School of Law and Government, and the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. My friend Dara Keogh mentioned it at the very beginning in his opening remarks. The Brexit Institute runs a Jean Monnet network, a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, several Jean Monnet modules. We are part of Horizon Europe, but we want to do more, including by strengthening our transatlantic relations, for example, here with Princeton University. So I would end by saying, stay tuned. We will have lots of other events and activities, and we look forward to engaging with you as we move ahead. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Federico.
Thanks, Herman and Giuliano. And let me say bye-bye to everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.